When we think of technology, we typically imagine something like a machine: the printing press, the steam engine, the personal computer. But the term technology doesn't necessarily mean something mechanical or even something physical. Any systematic process that extends or facilitates our ability to change and transform the world can be a technology. Language is a technology, politics is a technology, and logic is a technology. Specifically, logic is a system of technical operations for the production, preservation, or transmission of truth. In computer science, a system that applies formal rules to draw true conclusions is known as an inference engine. An inference engine runs on rules and inputs. Specifically, if valid inferential rules are applied to true inputs, then the engine inevitably churns out a correct output. An inference engine is the technology of logic made manifest, given physical form in the hardware of a computer. Looking through the other end of the telescope, the history of logic is the history of the development of more and more sophisticated inference engines. A 2,000-year engineering project to create the perfect technology for the production of absolute, universal certainty. You'll recall from Module 1 that Socrates had a student named Plato. After the execution of Socrates, Plato founded the first school of formal education known as the Academy. This is the historical origin of the modern university, so you can thank Plato for the existence of homework. Among Plato's students at the Academy was a philosopher called Aristotle. Aristotle's contributions to the world are too numerous to cover in this course. They include the first systematic application of natural science, the pre-Copernican conception of astronomy, and, crucially, the invention of formal logic. And the gear upon which the great machine of logical deduction ultimately turns is Aristotle's Law of Non-Contradiction, the LNC. The LNC is based on a simple observation: a thing cannot be both true and false at the same time. Aristotle cannot both be in Athens and in Macedonia at the same time. Socrates, at the same time, cannot be both mortal and immortal. With this simple tool, Aristotle built the foundations of the first inference engine, and it has continued to shape logical reasoning for over 2 millennia. From the LNC, Aristotle derived a set of formal rules of inference. These rules establish a system of principles describing the ways that concepts can be related to one another in order to preserve the truth of an argument from its premises to its conclusion. If followed, these principles guarantee the production of true conclusions. Philosophers love a good argument. This doesn't mean that philosophers like to fight about things, although that is also sometimes true. An argument in philosophy is a set of premises that are meant to establish the truth of a conclusion. Think of a premise as a statement that is submitted in support of some conclusion that the philosopher wants to test. Philosophical arguments often look something like this: all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. These 3 statements set out the formal structure of a simple yet devastatingly powerful truth engine known as a logical syllogism. Like a modern inference engine, a syllogism performs a series of structured operations upon a set of inputs. The inputs, in this case, are the premises. A syllogism is composed of 2 premises, called the major and the minor premise, or P1 and P2. In the case of the above syllogism, all humans are mortal is the major premise. It states a general principle that applies to all humans. Socrates is human is the minor premise. It states a specific fact about a single individual. Therefore, Socrates is mortal then represents the conclusion that necessarily follows from these premises. This type of syllogistic argument, which starts with a very general rule that applies to all cases and then applies it to test the truth of a specific case, is known as a deductive argument. The truth of the specific example is deduced from the truth of the general principle. Deductive reasoning thus moves from the top down, from the general to the specific, from the abstract to the particular. So why is this conclusion necessary? Why is Socrates necessarily mortal? Because of a rule of inference known as modus ponens, or the method of confirmation. Here's how it works. The major premise, all humans are mortal, has 2 parts, called the antecedent and the consequent. All humans is the antecedent. It sets up a condition. If anyone is a human, then they are mortal. This second part, then they are mortal, is the consequent. It tells us the consequences, what must be the case if the antecedent is true. In logic, this is referred to as an implication. If someone is human, then this logically implies that they are mortal. And here we now have a general law of conditional logic. that applies to all humans without exception. But this rule doesn't end with humans and mortality. We can extend this logic to all cases by formalizing it as if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Here, P is the antecedent and Q is the consequent. Q tells us the implication or consequence of P being the case. And with this general rule in place, we can now evaluate the truth of any specific statement involving P and Q, which is exactly what the minor premise does. Socrates is human. Well, we know from the major premise that anytime someone is a human, then, as a consequence, they are also mortal. So if all humans are mortal, and Socrates is human, then we are forced by the meaning of the terms themselves, plus the law of non-contradiction, to conclude that Socrates is necessarily mortal. It is impossible, upon pain of contradiction, for this conclusion to be false. Here, Aristotle has created a perfect inference engine, history's first algorithm for the production of necessary truth. But there's a catch. The truth of the conclusion depends on the inferential rules being valid and the premises being sound. So what do valid and sound mean in this context? Glad you asked. Aristotle was very concerned with the relationship between form and content. Consider a sculpture. A sculpture has a shape. It is typically a sculpture of something, and it is made out of some material, such as stone or metal. In Aristotelian philosophy, the shape of the sculpture represents its form, and the material that it is constructed from represents its content. The inferential rule of modus ponens represents the form of the syllogism. It stipulates the correct structure that ensures that the conditional implications guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Consider an alternative version of the syllogism. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a mortal. Therefore, Socrates is a human. This looks similar to our original syllogism, but with an important difference. The major premise is the same, but now the minor premise affirms the consequent rather than the antecedent. So what's wrong with that? The problem is that by switching out the antecedent P with the consequent Q in the minor premise, we have confused a necessary condition with a sufficient condition. A necessary condition is required for something to be the case. Socrates cannot be a human without being mortal. Being mortal is necessary for being human. But a necessary condition isn't sufficient for something to be the case. Socrates can be mortal without being a human. There are tons of things besides humans that are mortal. Cats are mortal. And somewhere, some philosopher has a cat named Socrates. And if a cat named Socrates is mortal, this does not in any way imply that the cat is also a human. Being mortal is a necessary condition for being a human, but it isn't a sufficient condition. A sufficient condition guarantees that something is the case. In arguments with the form of modus ponens, the presence of the antecedent P in the minor premise is sufficient to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. If Socrates is human, that is sufficient to guarantee that Socrates is also mortal. But when we replace the antecedent in the minor premise with the consequent, this breaks the logical sufficiency. If Socrates is mortal, then it might be the case that Socrates is human, or it might be the case that Socrates is the name of someone's cat. We don't know, because the argument doesn't tell us. This confusion between necessary and sufficient conditions is enough to shatter the validity of the argument. The truth of the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises. It is not truth-preserving. In fact, this version of the syllogism is an example of a formal logical fallacy known as affirming the consequent. A formal logical fallacy represents an invalid application of the rules of inference. Note that validity is concerned only with the formal structure of the argument, how the premises are arranged within the syllogism. Validity has nothing to do with the truth of the premises. It could be the case that the Socrates in question is the Athenian philosopher instead of the cat, in which case the conclusion would be true, and yet the argument itself would still remain invalid. It is entirely possible, common actually, to stumble accidentally upon a true conclusion as a result of invalid reasoning. But this represents luck, not logic. A condition can be necessary without being sufficient, or it can be sufficient without being necessary. It's actually fairly rare to discover a condition that is both necessary and sufficient. A condition that is both necessary and sufficient is good enough by itself to guarantee truth. Since it's necessary, it is required. No other condition can be substituted. And since it is sufficient, no other conditions are required. If you discover the necessary and sufficient conditions for something, congratulations. You've solved philosophy, and you can go home early for the day. There are many other valid forms of inference besides modus ponens. Another example is modus tollens, or the method of disconfirmation. Consider this version of the syllogism. All humans are mortal. Optimus Prime is not mortal. Therefore, Optimus Prime is not a human. This syllogism is formally valid. If all humans are mortal, then someone being immortal is sufficient to establish that they aren't human. In fact, Optimus Prime is a transformer and not a human, so the conclusion is true. But is Optimus Prime actually immortal? He's a giant sentient robot, but he seemingly can be killed. He's actually died many times over the long history of the Transformers franchise. What we have here is an argument that is valid. It has the right structure to preserve truth from the premises through to the conclusion. But you can't preserve truth that isn't there. The premises have to be true in order for the inferential validity to genuinely guarantee the truth of the conclusion. When an argument contains both a valid inferential form and premises that are true, we call that argument sound. Whereas validity concerns only the formal aspects of the argument, soundness concerns both the form and the content of the argument. Here is where Aristotle brings both form and content into unity. If any argumentative engine is built out of valid inferential rules and fed premises that are actually true, then it will necessarily produce a conclusion that is guaranteed to be true. Most logical fallacies concern the content of the premises rather than the validity of the logical form. Consider the following example. If drugs are illegal, then drugs are bad. Drugs are illegal, therefore drugs are bad. This is a perfectly valid example of modus ponens, but the reasoning is circular. The conclusion of the argument is already presumed in its premises. In logic, this type of argument is called begging the question, or petitio principii. Arguments of this sort, which may be formally valid but which nevertheless contain flawed reasoning, commit what is known as an informal logical fallacy. Unlike formal fallacies, which are always invalid, an informal fallacy may be formally valid and may even contain a true conclusion. Nevertheless, it arrives at its conclusion through flawed and imprecise reasoning. The proof that Socrates is mortal, however, is based on true and precise premises, and it is deduced using formally valid inferences. It, therefore, represents a sound argument. We know for a guaranteed fact that Socrates is mortal because the inference engine that produced the conclusion is perfectly constructed. It would represent a violation of the Law of Non-Contradiction for the conclusion to be false. But there are still a few problems. We've proved that Socrates is mortal and that Optimus Prime isn't a human. But these cases aren't exactly the same, are they? Socrates actually existed, while Optimus Prime is a fictional character. How can a statement be true or false if it refers to something non-existent, like Optimus Prime? Aristotle's syllogistic logic struggles with these kinds of cases, but modern analytic logic has tools that are able to deal with them. The emergence of contemporary analytic philosophy can in many ways be traced to the development in the early 20th century of the Predicate Calculus by the German logician Gottlob Frege. While Aristotle's syllogistic clockwork ran on premises formulated in natural language, Frege's system translates these statements into a form of universal symbolic calculus that allows for the analysis of a far larger and more complex class of statements. In a stroke, 2,000 years of Aristotelian syllogistic logic was overturned. Bertrand Russell and his mentor Alfred North Whitehead built upon this foundation by developing sophisticated first-order logics and second-order logics capable of even more powerful calculations. By the mid-20th century, the territory of logical analysis had expanded from statements describing actual states of affairs to formulae analyzing events in all possible worlds. American philosophers such as David Lewis, who we will read in Module 4, contributed to the development of possible world semantics that pushed reasoning beyond the analysis of what is true and into the metaphysics of what could be true, what must be true, and what would have been true had the history of the world swerved in this direction rather than that direction. Aristotle's simple principle of non-contradiction has evolved into a grand conceptual architecture, prescribing the fundamental structure of all possible realities. And the story doesn't end there. New logics continue to proliferate. Paraconsistent logics that tolerate contradiction. Quantum logics that mirror the strange behaviors of subatomic particles. Fuzzy logic, where truth comes in degrees. But one problem remains. Deductive logic is history's greatest engine for the production of certainty, but it can only run its inferential operations on premises that are already known. What is left out of the equation is discovery, to learn new facts about the world that transcend our catalogs of inferential rules and established terminologies. Then we have to leave the logician's armchair and go to nature itself. What is left out is experience, and it is to experience we will turn in our next lecture, and I'll see you there.